Hi there, and thanks for tuning into this short SCVO podcast. Following the EU referendum results, SCVO and our teams have been hard at work talking to our members, trying to identify their concerns as the negotiations go forward. And high on the list each time is the issue of human rights and protecting these rights that have been hard won over the years. With that in mind, we're very much pleased to be joined by Professor Alan Miller, who is an expert in international human rights law and the former chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission. And we're going to, between us, have a chat about what the future might hold in this post-Brexit time. So, Professor Miller, as I alluded to, your career is based in the study of human rights. Could you perhaps tell us about your career up until now and what you're currently working on?
Sure, Craig, yeah, and thanks for the opportunity. Well, in recent times, I was elected as first chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission and was chair of the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions. Those terms of office came to an end almost a year ago, and I'm now Special Envoy for the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, and working with the UN Crisis Response Unit as an independent expert. But probably most relevantly for the purposes of this conversation, I'm a member of the First Minister's Standing Council in Europe, and therefore very much tracking Brexit and the future of rights in Scotland and the UK and beyond.
Okay, thank you for that. It would certainly seem that in the sort of post-war era, certainly in the Western world, there's been steady progress in terms of developing human rights and entrenching these in law. But at the same time, it seems that people take these rights more and more for granted and almost, from the press they would say, burdened by excessive human rights. Do you feel that that's a dangerous mix and that this is a dangerous time for protecting these rights?
It's certainly time to stand up, and I hope that the third sector does increasingly become involved in its own interest and in the wider interest in this Brexit and rights debate. A lot of what you say is true about post-war developments. In my view, the impact of Brexit poses an unprecedented risk to the enjoyments we have come, in many respects, to take for granted in terms of human rights, including equality and wider social protections. So it has become a defining issue for Scotland, undoubtedly.
In the post-war era, as we mentioned, there have been these progress has been made. And to what extent do you think the EU and the institutions of the European Union have helped to shape that?
The EU has played a very, very influential role in stabilising peace and reducing conflict in Europe and promoting a shared sense and indeed framework of values and human rights and broadly solidarity. Has it done that perfectly? Is it doing it perfectly now? No. Does it need to do it a lot better? Yes. But I think particularly in times of post-Trump, the EU is going to have to play an increasing leadership role in values, rights, international rule of law within the international community. So it's ironic that at a time when the EU does need to be strengthened in order to do that, that it is facing a threat to its own progress by Brexit. Although ironically, increasingly people are telling me in the EU that following the UK's exit, it might actually be easier for the EU to take that leadership role in values and rights and defending international rule of law, especially post-Trump election.
Do you feel then at this time of effectively crisis for the EU with populist movements in each of the countries, an anti-European sentiment growing, the migrant crisis and so on and so forth, as Europe tries to stabilise itself during this time, to what extent are human rights high on the agenda, and is there political will there to do what you've just said, to ensure that the EU is this bulwark against Trumpism?
I think that it is becoming increasingly higher up on the agenda, and maybe counterintuitively, it may well become even higher up again because of the election of President Trump and the UK's positioning vis-à-vis the EU and the US, that I think there might well be seen to be a renewed sort of affirmation of human rights, the values, the legality, the need for international rule of law. And so, despite its shortcomings, which were not so much the EU, but a lot of the member states within the EU in facing up to its obligations under the refugee crisis, I think we are beginning to see, in the likes of Angela Merkel and others, a defence of the values upon which it's based, and quite a commitment that these are going to be defended, and therefore Brexit is seen from a European point of view as being something that is going with this reaction, regressive trend, and we might well see, and it might come out, I'm sure it will, in the Brexit negotiations, that the EU might take an increasingly robust stance in defence of the values that it sees as being necessary in today's very uncertain times.
The UK, as you said there, has always been a bit of an awkward member of the European Union, and from the sounds of it has actually prevented the EU from progressing maybe as quickly as it could, and certainly environmental groups would say that UK departments often hold up legislation, and it seems to be the same with human rights. In the past, you've described Westminster as being toxic in terms of its adherence to human rights and its obligations. As these powers are repatriated to the UK and were removed from the auspices of the European Court of Justice, what are the risks then for people in the UK that these rights could be eroded in the not too distant future?
Well, there's a real risk, there's unprecedented risk, I think. The EU guarantees of rights, once removed, will there be the same guarantee given the prevailing political culture at Westminster for all of these rights to be maintained? I very much doubt that. And therefore, from within the First Minister Standing Council of Europe, there's been three principles that have sort of come out of that and are now increasingly broadly recognised to guide Scotland in this Brexit process. The first is that there should be no regression in the current level of human rights, including equality and other social protections we currently enjoy. Secondly, Scotland should not be left behind future progressive European developments. And thirdly, Scotland should be able to continue and to increasingly take a lead in these areas. So Scotland's government has put forward a pretty reasonable compromise, Scotland's place in Europe, which tries to provide a way of these principles being realised through continued membership of the European single market. It looks increasingly unlikely that the UK is going to entertain that proposal, and that therefore the future of rights in Scotland looks increasingly like it will be part of the question in a referendum debate on independence as to what kind of country is it that we want to be.
Europe, it seems, has been and will presumably continue to be somewhat a gold standard in terms of human rights, certainly on the progressive end of the spectrum. You mentioned that Scotland would want to at least maintain that floor of human rights and, where possible, to mirror Europe. To what extent within the devolution settlement is there any scope for Scotland to mirror Europe and to adhere to this best practice, or is too much of it tied to the current settlement?
Well, the reality is that there are things that Scotland has been and should continue to do, and including reflecting progressive European developments within the devolved areas of competence. But the reality is that many of these EU guarantees are in areas of employment, equality, data protection, environment, consumer standards, all of which are currently reserved areas. And that's why it's to be hoped that the UK government does change tack and does either accept that the UK stays in the single market, which looks almost a dead duck, but that at least Scotland can continue to stay in the European single market, because that would be the best guarantee for the continued enjoyment of those rights. The risk is that when they are brought back to the UK and initially to Westminster, that there won't be the same confidence that we can have that these guarantees will continue to exist. And these are big areas that impact on our day-to-day lives. Equal treatment in the workplace, proper food standards. If we're going to get into a trade agreement with the United States, then already people are talking, does this mean GM food products are going to come into the UK market? What will that do for Scotland's food and drink industry and international brand? So that if the UK has a hard Brexit and enters into these free trade agreements with the US and others, the standards will be much lower than the EU, and that's going to increasingly lower standards within Scotland. The vision presented by the Prime Minister of a low-tax, deregulated, competitive economy will have a race to the bottom in terms of rights, including increasing inequality. And evidence from around the world is the less equal a society is, the less happy it is. So that's why all of this stuff really, really matters, and I really strongly encourage the third sector to, from its own point of view, find out just what the impacts, and I'm very pleased to see that SCVO did a survey recently on that, and recognises that it really has to become very engaged in this debate, in its own interest and that of the communities that it serves.
Certainly, as I mentioned, it's charities from across the third sector, a whole spectrum of organisations who have raised the prospect of human rights, and it just shows how embedded it is in day-to-day life. As you said, you did pick up on a couple of areas there that could immediately be areas for concern. Are there any other areas that specifically charities, who are listening might think this could impact me, and this is something we should be actively involved in opposing and feeding into the current debate, which at the moment human rights has been somewhat sidetracked by economics and the global effect?
Yeah, well, I think from a human rights point of view, there's a few things. One is that there undoubtedly is going to be a real risk of regression if powers are brought back from EU to Westminster and then not subsequently devolved to Scotland. Secondly, the UK will then become freer once out of the EU to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, and the protections we have from the European Court of Human Rights, which are very, very far-reaching and underpin a lot of these protections we currently have. That's very much then on the table, and Theresa May's past position is that's what she wants to do. Brexit makes that easier. But then the impact on the economy is linked to human rights as well, because if we're going to head towards a deregulated, low-tax, competitive economic model, we all know what that means. And if we enter into these trade agreements, they're never good for rights and social protection. So that there will be an impact on the funding, the allocation of resources to third sector bodies themselves, to those that they serve in terms of social security, wages, housing, health, education. So you have to look at the whole picture, and that's why it really is so imperative that all of us, including the third sector, really do explore what the impact will be and engage with what, the reasoned and reasonable compromise or otherwise positions. What are the options that we can take to avoid regression, not be left behind, and continue to be taking a lead towards the sort of country that we want to be and the values that we want to underpin that.
And I suppose that would not just require the third sector to be speaking to government and think tanks and people who push the debate, but as we mentioned at the start, there is at a personal level, people seem not to really understand what these rights mean for them in their day-to-day lives, and that there's not a constant trajectory of improvement, that these things can be taken away. What do you think we have to do to speak to people on a personal level about how important this is?
Well, I think it's a big role and a virtually unique role that the third sector has, in that it has so much far-reaching access into those communities who are most vulnerable and the most disempowered and likely to suffer the most consequences. And as we've seen with the Brexit debate and the presidential elections in the US, ultimately it's public opinion that is decisive. And if public opinion isn't informed and aware of what's at stake and what steps it can take to protect the public interest, then we are living in very uncertain times, and it's by no means a given that unless serious work is done by the likes of the third sector and others, that public opinion will reflect the reality of the circumstances that we're living in just now.
Well, thanks very much for that, Professor Miller. That was a really sober analysis of the current state of affairs, and I hope that will act as a call to arms to members of the third sector who have listened today. So thank you very much.